I've worked the night shift at the old metal factory for 7 years. The place is a nightmare of rusted pipes, screaming machines, and shadows that stretch too far under the flickering lights. Most of the guys say the factory is haunted. I never believed them until one night changed everything. It was past midnight, and I was alone near the stamping machines, running routine checks. The air was thick with the stench of oil and scorched metal, and the rhythmic pounding of machinery echoed through the vast space. Then, without warning, everything stopped. The silence was deafening. At first, I thought it was just another power issue, but then I heard something. A scraping sound, slow and deliberate, like metal being dragged across concrete. I turned toward the source, my heart hammering in my chest. Near the far end of the workshop, past the idle machines, I saw movement. A figure stood just beyond the reach of the light, its form unnatural. Too tall, too thin. Its limbs jerked as if its joints were locked in place, but it moved, inching forward with unnatural precision. My breath caught in my throat as I noticed its face, or rather, the lack of one. Just smooth, pale skin stretched over where eyes, a nose, or a mouth should have been. The longer I looked, the more my stomach twisted in dread. Then the worst part happened. It turned its head toward me. Not gradually, but in a sudden snapping motion, like a machine locking into place. My body screamed at me to run, but I was frozen, trapped in its eyeless gaze. And then, the factory roared back to life. Machines sputtered and groaned as power surged through the building, lights flickering wildly. In that stuttering glow, I saw it more clearly. Its elongated fingers, the way its body seemed stitched together like a rag doll made of flesh. It took a step forward, and the metal beneath it groaned as if struggling under an immense weight. That was all I needed. I turned and ran, not caring if I tripped, not caring if I screamed. When I reached the control room, I slammed the door shut, panting. My coworkers found me minutes later, my face pale, my hands shaking. I told them everything, but none of them believed me. None except for Javier, the oldest worker there. He didn't laugh. He just muttered, "You saw it, didn't you?" "Didn't." Javier refused to say anything else that night, just shook his head and walked away. But after my shift ended, he found me in the parking lot. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette. "It's been here for years," he muttered. "We don't talk about it because talking about it makes it notice you." My stomach churned at his words. "What is it?" I asked, but Javier only glanced toward the factory, the glowing red lights from the control panels flickering in the distance. "A mistake," he finally said. "Something that shouldn't exist." That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, that faceless thing twitching toward me, its long fingers scraping against steel. The next few nights I tried to act normal, but something was off in the factory. The air felt heavier, the machines groaned louder than usual, and the shadows stretched unnaturally long beneath the overhead lights. Then, workers started complaining about strange noises, whispers beneath the sound of grinding metal, distant footsteps where no one should be. One guy, Luis, even swore he saw something watching him from the catwalks above, a shape that vanished the moment he turned his head. By the end of the week, no one wanted to be alone in the factory. Even the bravest men worked in pairs, throwing nervous glances over their shoulders. But it didn't matter, because it wasn't after just anyone. It was after me. One night I was on break, drinking coffee near the locker rooms, when the power flickered again. The entire factory groaned as if something massive had settled into its foundations. My radio crackled with static, then a voice, distorted, wrong. "Come back," it whispered. "You saw me. I saw you." My blood turned to ice. Then, in the reflection of the metal locker beside me, I saw it, standing right behind me. I didn't turn. I couldn't. I ran. My feet pounded against the concrete, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I reached the exit, slamming into the door and bursting outside into the freezing night air. When I looked back through the grimy factory window, I saw it watching me. Motionless, its faceless head tilted slightly as if waiting. I didn't go back the next night. I told my supervisor I was sick, but deep down I knew I'd never step inside that factory again. Not after what I saw. But avoiding it didn't matter, because whatever that thing was, it wasn't done with me. That night I woke up to the sound of something moving in my apartment. My breath hitched. I lived alone. The noise was faint, metal scraping against wood, like nails dragging across my bedroom door. I reached for my phone, but before I could grab it, the lights in my room flickered. A sharp static filled my ears, and then the whisper. "You left." I followed. The air turned freezing. My body refused to move, paralyzed by terror. I didn't need to turn my head to know it was there. I felt it, standing in the corner of my room, waiting, watching. Then, the sound of something creaking. It was getting closer. Summoning every ounce of courage, I forced my body to move. I leaped from my bed, blindly reaching for anything, my lamp, my chair, anything I could use to defend myself. But before I could react, the lights went out completely. In the darkness, something grabbed my wrist. Its fingers were long, cold, unnatural. I screamed, struggling, but its grip tightened, pulling me forward. My feet scraped against the floor as I fought against its impossible strength. Just when I thought I was being dragged into the abyss, I remembered what Javier said. Talking about it makes it notice you. But what if I could make it let go? I gasped out the words, "You don't belong here." My voice was barely above a whisper, but the thing stopped. I could feel it hesitate, its grip loosening. "You are a mistake," I shouted this time. And suddenly, the lights flickered back on. It was gone. The room was empty. The air was still, freezing, but the thing was no longer there. My wrist was ice cold, the skin where it touched me raw and bruised. I packed a bag that night and left the city. I never returned to that factory. I never even said goodbye to Javier. But sometimes in the dead of night, I hear it again. A faint whisper in the static, a shadow moving in the corner of my vision. I don't look, I don't listen, because I know the truth now. You don't escape things like that. You only make them forget you exist. I've worked the night shift at the local police station for 3 years, but that night was different. The usual quiet hours were interrupted by strange calls, noises that didn't make sense, static-filled voices with no identifiable caller. I'd brushed it off as technical issues. The station was old, after all, with equipment that hadn't been replaced in decades. But when the phone rang again at 3:15 a.m., I was already on edge. This time, there was no static, no broken words. It was as if someone was sitting there in complete silence, breathing softly. I tried to speak, but the voice that came through was almost a whisper, cold and distant. "Help me, it's coming for me." My heart sank. I didn't recognize the voice, and it sent a chill through me that I couldn't shake. I quickly looked through the available reports for any similar incidents, but nothing stood out. I turned back to the phone, about to call the number back, when I heard it again. A faint, almost inaudible scratching sound coming from the hallway outside my office. I froze. The station was supposed to be empty.
The officers on duty were in the back rooms or out on patrol, and everyone else had long gone home. The air felt suddenly heavy, thick with a strange pressure. I stood slowly, not daring to make a sound, and crept to the hallway. The scratching continued, growing louder, closer, as if something or someone was dragging itself across the floor. When I reached the end of the hallway, I could see nothing but the empty floor stretching out in front of me. No sign of anyone, nothing out of place. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered, casting strange, elongated shadows along the walls. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, just for a second. A figure. It was standing by the entrance to the holding cells. A dark shape hunched over, too tall and thin. I blinked, and it was gone. But the feeling of something watching me didn't fade. My skin crawled. I had to investigate. I cautiously approached the holding cells, my hand gripping the flashlight tightly, as if it could offer me some protection. The hallway was silent now, save for the occasional hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I reached the door of the first holding cell and paused, feeling my breath catch. The light flickered above me again, casting a sickly glow. I swung the door open, empty. My hand shook slightly as I moved to the next cell. When I opened that door, I saw it, on the floor, in the farthest corner, a dark shape. At first I thought it was just a shadow, but then I noticed the shape was moving, slowly dragging itself across the floor. It was unmistakable, a human-like figure but twisted, malformed. I took a step back, nearly tripping over my own feet. The figure's head snapped toward me. Its face was a blank void, just skin stretched across a skull, hollow where the eyes should be. It let out a low, guttural moan that sounded more animal than human. I backed up, my mind racing for a plan, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. My hand was still holding the flashlight, but I was too terrified to shine it in the creature's face. I knew that if I did, I would never forget what I saw. The thing crawled closer, dragging, its twisted limbs scraping against the floor. Then just as it reached out for me, the lights above me flickered one final time and went out entirely. In the pitch black, I could feel the air shift. The thing was there, right next to me. I could hear it breathing, its presence suffocating. And then I felt it, a hand cold as ice brushing against my arm. I panicked and ran, not caring if I stumbled, not caring if I screamed. I burst out of the holding area, slamming the door behind me. I didn't look back, couldn't look back. I sprinted to the front desk where I found another officer, Terrence, still awake and watching the monitors. I must have looked insane. My face pale, my breathing ragged. I couldn't explain it at first, but when I managed to get the words out, Terrence's expression changed. He had seen it too. I stood frozen, my heart hammering in my chest, the air thick with dread. I could still feel the cold breath of the creature, its presence pressing in on me like a vice. But then, as if it had heard my thoughts, it stopped. The room fell into an eerie silence. For a moment, I dared to hope that it was over, that the creature had gone back into the shadows. But the silence was shattered by a sudden bone-chilling screech that sent waves of terror down my spine. It wasn't a scream. It was the sound of metal being scraped against metal, coming from the holding cells. The same sound I had heard hours earlier, only now it was sharper, more desperate. Before I could react, a voice cut through the darkness, not from the creature, but from the phone on the desk. The same voice I had heard before, but now it was clearer, distorted with malice. "It's too late now." I whipped around, my eyes scanning the room, but I saw nothing. My breath came in short, frantic bursts. I looked back at the holding cells, and to my horror, the thing was there, standing in the doorway. But this time it wasn't alone. It was surrounded by a shadow, an endless blackness that seemed to swallow everything in its path. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. Then, in a flash, the creature lunged forward. But it didn't touch me. It vanished. The shadow consumed it in an instant, pulling the thing into its void, dragging it back into whatever hell it had come from. The air grew warm again, and the lights flickered back to life. The oppressive weight lifted, leaving me breathless and trembling. I stood there for what felt like hours, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The phone on the desk suddenly went silent, and I dared not touch it. The room was empty, but as I left the station that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness hadn't fully gone. I didn't look back as I walked through the door. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I stepped out into the cold night air. The creature was gone, for now. But I knew deep down that something like that doesn't just disappear. It waits. And when it comes back, it won't be for me. It will be for someone else.
I work the late shift at a small convenience store on the edge of town. It's the kind of place most people only stop at when they need something quick, a snack or a drink. But it's also the place where the night feels too long and the hours too empty. That night, it was just me and the dim light above the counter. The hum of the refrigerators in the back and the occasional car driving by kept me company. The clock ticked slowly toward 2 a.m., and I was beginning to feel the weight of the night pressing down on me. Everything felt unnervingly quiet, almost too quiet. Then the door chime rang. It was a sound I was used to, but this time it was different. It sounded louder, sharper, and it caught me off guard. I glanced up, expecting another tired customer coming in for coffee or cigarettes, but what I saw stopped me cold. A man stood at the door, shrouded in a long, dark coat that dragged on the ground. His face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, and his posture was stiff, unnaturally so. It was the middle of the night. Who would be wearing something like that at this hour? The man didn't move. He just stood there staring at me. I felt a chill run down my spine. I asked if I could help him, but he didn't answer. The silence stretched between us, suffocating. He took one slow step inside. The door shut behind him with an unsettling finality, and I felt the temperature in the store drop a few degrees. It wasn't just the air that changed. The atmosphere felt heavier, like something was watching me, waiting. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Then, the man moved again. This time he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, old-fashioned pocket watch. He stared at it, then at me, before he slowly started walking toward the back of the store, never saying a word. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't obey. I tried to force my body to move, but it was like I was stuck in place, watching as he walked toward the storage room. I wanted to shout, to ask him what he was doing, but something in the back of my mind told me not to make a sound. My hands trembled, and I clenched them into fists, trying to calm my nerves. The store felt suffocating now, like the walls were closing in. I didn't know why, but I felt like I was in danger, like whatever was happening was wrong on a level I couldn't understand. The man reached the back room and stood at the door, just staring at it. He didn't try to open it. Then, without any warning, the lights in the store flickered. The air turned cold, almost freezing, and I heard a soft whisper. So faint, I thought. I imagined it. "Time's almost up. The voice was low, like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I turned to the counter, but when I looked back toward the back of the store, the man was gone. The door to the storage room was wide open, and I could see nothing but the darkness beyond. I was shaking now, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't know if I should go back there or call for help. My feet finally moved, but not to the phone. I stepped toward the back room, my breath ragged. As I approached the door, I could feel something was terribly wrong. The temperature had dropped even further, and I could hear the sound of my footsteps echoing through the stillness. But it wasn't just my footsteps. There was another sound, soft, dragging, like something was moving on the floor behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. My head was spinning, and my thoughts were racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then I heard it again. This time, it was louder, closer. I felt the presence before I saw it. The man was standing just behind me, but his face was now visible beneath the brim of his hat. His eyes were black holes, no light, no life. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My voice was trapped in my throat as the man reached forward. His hand was cold, colder than anything I had ever felt before. He placed it on my shoulder, and I froze, unable to move. "You've been waiting too long," he whispered, his voice now clear, but unnaturally calm. "The time is up." Before I could react, the world around me went completely black. The lights in the store blinked out, and I was plunged into a void of nothingness. I couldn't breathe, couldn't see, couldn't move. Then, as quickly as it had started, everything returned to normal. The lights flickered back on, the cold air vanished, and the store was silent. The man was gone. The door was wide open, but there was no sign of him. I stumbled to the counter, gasping for air, feeling as if I had just escaped something terrible. I couldn't explain what had just happened. Was it real? Had I imagined it? The phone on the counter rang, and I froze. Again. The voice on the other end was calm, distant, and chilling. "It's not over. He's coming back." I never worked the late shift again after that night. I left the store, and I never returned. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls through the trees outside my house, I can still hear that door chime. And I know, whatever it was, whatever I saw, it's still out there, waiting for someone else.
I work at a small, dimly lit bar on the corner of a quiet street. Most nights it's just me and a few regulars. We know each other well. There's nothing unusual, nothing strange about the place, except for that one night. It was just after midnight when I first noticed it. The bar was nearly empty, save for a man sitting at the far end of the counter, nursing a glass of whiskey. He wasn't a regular. In fact, I hadn't seen him before. He was tall, dressed in a worn leather jacket, and his face was hidden in shadow. The only thing that stood out was his pale, almost sickly skin. He didn't make a sound. He just stared at his drink, his fingers wrapped around the glass as if he was trying to hold on to something. At first, I thought nothing of it. I was cleaning the glasses, wiping down the counter when I noticed something strange. The room felt colder. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the atmosphere. It felt wrong. My instincts told me to keep my distance, but I couldn't help it. I had to know who this man was, why he was here, and why he wasn't speaking. So, I walked over to him. "You okay, man?" I asked, trying to make small talk. He looked up at me then. His eyes were dark, almost completely black, with no whites showing. For a moment, I froze. It felt like his gaze was piercing through me, seeing everything I had ever done. I swallowed hard and repeated myself, but he didn't answer. He took a long sip from his glass, set it down slowly, and then in a voice so low I could barely hear it, he said, "I'm not here for a drink." Those words didn't make sense, but before I could respond, he turned his head toward the door. I followed his gaze, but there was nothing there. Just the empty street, the occasional car passing by. When I looked back at him, he was gone. His glass sat on the counter, untouched, but there was no sign of him. No sound of the door opening. I checked the back and the bathroom. Nothing. It was like he had vanished into thin air. I couldn't explain it. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the glass. It wasn't even warm anymore. It was like he had never been there, like it was all in my head. But that feeling, the wrongness, lingered. It didn't feel like a normal night anymore. I grabbed the glass, planning to clean it up, when I noticed something strange. There was a small scrap of paper beneath it, wedged between the glass and the counter. I unfolded it, but my hands were shaking so badly that it was hard to read. The message was short, just a few words written in hurried, jagged handwriting. "He's still waiting." I stood frozen, trying to make sense of it. The handwriting didn't look like anything I had seen before. And what did it mean? Waiting. For what? I checked the bar again, looking for any sign of the man, but there was nothing. No sign of struggle, no indication that anyone had been here except for me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, though. It was like I was being watched, but I was the only one here. My breath became shallow, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The air in the room had turned heavy, thick with tension. Something was about to happen, but I didn't know what. Then the door opened. I whipped around, my heart racing. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the streetlights outside. I couldn't make out any features, but I knew. It was him, the man from before. He was back, and this time, his presence was more unsettling than ever. As he took a step into the bar, I felt the temperature drop again. The lights flickered, and the room seemed to close in on me. I couldn't breathe. He took another slow step forward, his eyes never leaving mine. I couldn't move. The cold in the air intensified, the kind of cold that made your skin crawl. The hairs on my neck stood on end, and for a moment, I thought I was going to pass out. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't work. My throat tightened, and I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The man took another step, and this time, I could feel the weight of his presence pressing in on me, suffocating. He was close now, just a few feet away. Then, he whispered, his voice a low rasp, "It's your turn now." The words chilled me to the bone, and before I could react, I felt the sharp sting of something cold against my neck. It wasn't the touch of a hand. It was the edge of something. Something cold, like metal. I could feel it, but I couldn't see it. My breath came in short gasps, and I fought to get away, but my body wouldn't respond. I closed my eyes, preparing for the worst. I thought I was done for. When I opened my eyes again, the man was gone. The door was wide open, and the street outside was as empty as ever. The cold lifted, and the lights flickered back to normal. I stumbled to the counter, panting and shaking. Was it a hallucination? A nightmare? I didn't know. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't over. The man might have vanished, but I knew he would return. And next time, I wouldn't be so lucky.